My hat! All right, so you are deep in the hobby now. Let's just say you've been driving RTRs for quite some time. I don't know, Arma, Traxxas, whatever it may be, Red Cat, and you want to just hop up your vehicle and you just invested on new electronics. Well, something that you're going to have to do is solder. Now, let's just say you're not buying these electronics because you're worried about soldering. You don't want to solder, you don't know how to solder, you've never soldered these electronics before. Well, uh, first thing you're going to need is you're going to need your pliers to strip the wire. Now, you can do it with a blade or a knife, but sometimes you accidentally end up cutting the wire. So here, if you notice, many pliers will have the gauge here. And whenever I use them, I will use this, but I won't go all the way in, and I'm actually rotating the wire, and then that's when I'll hold it, and then I'll pull. And if you strip a strand or two, I don't see one, it's all right, don't worry about it, but that is all you have to do. And you really only need to expose about that much wire. Something else that I recommend, if you don't have any, get a set of helping hands. These generally look like this. I took the magnifying glass off. But that way you can set them here. And notice I put the fuel tubing here. For the fuel tubing, you just need small little pieces. So this is all you do. You just cut about 1 centimeter of tubing. And you want 2 pieces, 1 for each. And you're just going to stick them in there. And the reason why is you're using this as an insulator so that the heat does not transfer from whatever you're soldering over to here. Now, this is not bare, this has insulation, but still, sometimes you may be soldering, for example, little tabs that are bare. But anyway, we have that, we have the helping hands. And what about soldering? Well, you've probably seen something like this, and this is a soldering gun. Now, they're very good, you have to clean the tips, they get kind of dirty, but they're big and bulky, and it's a pain. So what about a soldering iron? Well, if you go to stores, sometimes you'll find soldering irons, say, let's say Walmart, Sears, when Sears used to be open, our Sears closed. And used to buy soldering irons, and they had deals, maybe $8 for a soldering iron, 10. The only problem with them is they were usually about 5, 10 watt soldering irons, and they didn't reach high enough temperature, so you would get something that's called a cold solder. So cold solder means you didn't get the terminals or the solder hot enough, so it was cold, so you don't get an actual contact, and then your ESC can't transfer the current over to your motor can't get the current from your ESC, so it doesn't work. And then some people actually return the electronics thinking they're bad, when in reality it was just a bad solder job. But I just picked this up, and this is the purpose of this video. This is actually a pretty good soldering iron. It's just over $20. I believe I paid $24 for this. And it does have the LED lights, so you don't need them. But supposedly it goes up to 750 Fahrenheit. Solder melts at about, depending on the type of solder and the thickness, 360 to 375 Fahrenheit. So this soldering iron should actually be good enough for your soldering needs. And the reason why is because if it can go up to 750 Fahrenheit, which is about almost 400 degrees Celsius, And solder melts at about 185 degrees Celsius. So I think I said, 360, 370, somewhere around there. There should be plenty because you're going to have to heat up the wire and the solder should melt on it. But you don't want to apply too much heat, which is the problem with the heat gun. And the reason why I'm using this is less expensive than buying a soldering station. Soldering station, you can control the heat. A soldering station is really the best option, but the problem with the soldering station for beginners is you're looking at over $100 for a soldering station. So for 24, under 30, this is a good option, and I'm going to go ahead and try it right now. So with these soldering irons, as soon as you plug them in, they're on. So that's something that you have to be careful. Another recommendation is I like working on a wood surface such as a cutting board. If you have just a piece of a plank, that works as well. Even though if solder drops on it, it may mark the wood, but it's not going to catch on fire. Versus if you're soldering directly on your mat, you will melt the mat, so you're going to start destroying your mat, which is something to keep in mind. Now, so for that reason, this does come with this little plate where you can sit the soldering iron, and that works. Something else too, you can invest in something like this. Soldering iron would just sit there. And I actually prefer this. So this is what I'm going to be using. But again, if you don't have something like that, this plate is good enough. All right, now solder. A lot of solder is going to be a 60-40 blend, which is solder. There's different types of solder. Some of them can actually have precious materials such as silver. Your common solder is generally going to be tin and lead, but you also have different thicknesses, different gauges on this. So I'm going to use the thinner one. It's actually prefer the way it melts. But this will eventually get hot, so do not touch this surface. Be very, very careful. If you actually get your hand close, do not touch it close, you will start feeling the heat. The more you use it, you will actually start noticing a color change as well. Something too is this just screws on. So you want to make sure it's screwed on properly before you turn it on, because then it'll be hot. Don't touch this. It's going to be hot. If you don't remember, you can always just grab some pliers, for example, and then you can turn. Now, this one is on, so nothing happened. But anyway, all you do is, for these, you just kind of wait, and sometimes you will see a little bit of smoke coming out. The camera's not catching it, but there's a little bit of smoke. That's normal, don't worry about it. It's generally from just the surfaces. And to be honest, once the wire is nice and hot, you should be able to put the solder on the wire, and it should melt and coat the wire. All right, and this is called tinning, which you want to do to your wire. Let's see, I need to tin this other side. And the reason why is this will ensure that you get a good solder once you're soldering the wire to whatever terminal. If you do not pre-tin, you can get what is called a cold solder. All right. It's not going to sit there for very long, so I'm not too worried. But anyway, you should get a shiny finish, very shiny finish, almost chrome-like. Once you have that, then you are good to go. Now, you have to do that to the wire to each end. Now, when it comes to the ESC and to motor, you have to also pre-tin the terminals. The last one was actually the best one. All right, and they are all good. So now we can do the motor. And the motor, one of the things I like about these helping hands is this little section here. I just put the motor there, keep it from just tumbling and rolling. But you're going to do the same thing. So you're just going to, you will see how the solder just starts spreading on the terminal. So hopefully you can see it on the camera. I'm not sure. And I'm just tapping on the terminal with the solder. So I'm grabbing the solder, I'm just tapping on the terminal. All right, so we're going to continue soldering. So soldered the ESC and the motor. Now everything's installed. You can ignore that. That's not the point of this video. But let's say, all right, you did the soldering iron. All right, you have a soldering iron that works. 20 bucks. It's an all right soldering iron. But let's just say you still don't want to spend on a soldering station, and you decide to buy a soldering gun. All right, well, that works too. You can tin and do everything with a soldering gun. A lot of people do not like soldering guns, and the reason why is because the tip is not as fine. So doing precise work can be more of a challenge. This would be an example of a soldering gun right here. Now, the tip is clean. This is just from the coating on there. But you can also tin and do everything with a soldering gun. The only thing is, once again, this is probably about $40, so it's twice as much as the other soldering iron. It heats a lot more than the soldering iron, which, to be honest, you solder everything quicker. You just have to be careful with the amount of heat that you apply to your electronics. That's really the only thing with the soldering gun. Yes, the other one, you can solder smaller stuff, finer stuff, but with these electronics, to be honest, it doesn't really matter. You can do it with both, and I'm about to show you. So first thing, we're going to put the 5mm bullets on it, and I'm going to put them on my helping hands. Now remember to use some fuel tubing, and the reason why is you want the fuel tubing, I'm heating up the gun, you want the fuel tubing to work as an insulator so that the heat from this terminal, from the 5mm bullet, doesn't transfer over the arms, because then it's going to make your soldering a greater challenge. And the other thing that you do is you just place the soldering gun anywhere on the terminal, and eventually you will see that this will get hot enough to where I will be able to touch, just tap in there, and the solder will just start to melt, just like that, see? And that's it. And that terminal is now tinned. I mean, for the wires, just put the tip of the gun on the tip of the wire. And just hold it there, and then it'll heat up. And then you can just touch the wire with this once the wire is hot enough, and it'll just start melting the solder. Now, just so you can see a little better through the camera, I'm going to pull a little extra solder. Not yet. There we go. See, so I'm just touching the wire. now that it's tinned, I can go ahead and grab my 5mm bullets. Place them here, and then, to be honest, I could have just used one at a time. But just to make it easier for me, so I guess I can move it up here. There we go. So I'm going to use 2 sets of helping hands for this. I mean, you could just use one. And just going to set one on top of the other. There we go. And want it to be relatively straight. There we go. All right. And well, just take this off. Apply some heat. I'm going to melt some of that solder. Push the wire down so it makes a nice, good contact with the terminal. And I know I said terminal. Well, I mean, it's a terminal. It's a 5mm bullet. That's going to be my terminal. And you can't really see, but one of the things that I'm trying here, actually I want to tighten this, is I want the height from this one to be a little lower than this one, just on the contact point. So let me show you before here. So I'm actually setting the height like this so that the one with the wire is always applying pressure on the one with the bullet. So as soon as I heat them up, the wire just kind of drops. That's it. And the only thing that you do is you just send this one through, and tubing shrinks quite a lot. It can shrink to about half its diameter. But that is it. So notice this is very close to the diameter on the red one. This is actually the size I prefer. I ran out of this size in the black one, so I'm actually using a larger diameter that I would use for 8 gauge or even 10 gauge. But this is 12 gauge wire, so I actually want something smaller. So if you're using 8 gauge wire, you're probably going to go with 5/16. For 12, a quarter's fine. Just go with a 1/4 inch. So now I need to shrink those, and you can actually apply some heat with multiple things. A lighter, for example. Heat gun works, doesn't have to be a lighter. You don't have to have a flame. I mean, you could do this on your stove. If you're a kid, have an adult do it. But one of the things, make sure this is lined up. And when you're shrinking this, put the flame away from your electronics. You don't want to burn this. And you're not going to leave the flame on. You're really just going to rotate. You're going to start shrinking. And you want to do it as even as possible. I'm actually shrinking this side first. That's where I want it to seal first, and then I'm going to move it all the way over here just to try to get some of the air inside of there out. All right. Don't leave the flame on there too long. You don't want to burn your tubing. Then it just looks bad. All right, that is it. Another thing too, if you use a heat gun, you won't have a problem, but sometimes you can just apply the heat to this part, the metallic part, and it'll just start shrinking the tubing. Especially if you're using bare wires, that's something you can do. So, here we go. 1/4" tubing is a lot easier for 12 gauge. I mean, it's the correct size. But here we go. All right, see? Perfect. And one of the things that I want you to notice is on the black one, you're not going to notice, but on the red one, look, see, it's not burnt. You should not be burning this. You're just shrinking it. If you have scorch marks, it means that you left the flame on too long. So if you want something that's relatively inexpensive, which one do I prefer? $20 soldering iron or the 30-something, say $40 soldering gun? And the answer is, I prefer the soldering gun. Now, the soldering iron does have a fine tip, but to be honest, you can get these tips, they come in pairs. It's the same thing that the gun's going to come with. So when you have to replace them, they're only about $8, $9 at your local hardware store. For example, I got these at Ace. But it's not a point, but you can still solder fine items by just using the little tips here on the edges, or by using this here. The other thing too is because this one gets hot really fast, what ends up happening is soldering iron with the inexpensive ones, obviously I'm not talking about the soldering stations, if you start applying heat here, it takes longer for it to reach that temperature, or as soon as you apply it here, it loses temperature, so you actually end up heating the entire metal slowly. So you end up heating the entire wire slowly. So by the time it gets to the temperature that you need, you've already heated up the entire wire, and you may have actually heated up your ESC or whatever electronic you are soldering. Versus the gun, it will reach a higher temperature much faster. I mean, this one is 100 watts, for example. And what will happen is it will get so hot so fast it'll actually heat up that little portion, that surface area, really fast, so you can apply the solder. You can solder the wire, it could be 2 wires, a wire to a terminal, whatever it is, quickly before the heat transfers over here, and then start cooling this really fast before the heat transfers over here. So, I mean, many times I'm holding the wire with my hand, and I'm using the gun to solder, and I will still be able to hold the wire. So always feel on the insulation of the wire if something's too hot or not. You may have to not apply heat, but that's the reason why, if you want to do this in an inexpensive fashion or spend as little money as possible, it's about $40 for a soldering gun. And those are my thoughts and my reason as to why. So other than that, I hope you find this helpful, and I hope this motivates you to get into the hobby. There's easy ways to do things without spending too much money. Thank you so much for watching.